Other than tradition, is there a literal connection with the birth of Christ to this time that we celebrate his birth?
Does Christ's birth really fall on the 25th? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Does Christ's birth, did it actually come around 1225? And that is a great one, because if it didn't, how did we get that? Can I add to your question, Barney? Okay. How did we get this date? And we better not take it. Good. No one's up, so no more. This is too many, as it is. Does Christ's birth actually fall in 1225? Most likely not. Because this is the start of the rainy season. If you know anything about Israel right now, it's flooding over there. All my friends send me pictures. There are 300 and 400 foot waterfalls right now, coursing down the Judean hills and crashing into the Dead Sea area, and it's just amazing what goes on. And so you would not have, if you valued your sheep, you would not have them out in the fields, the hills of around Bethlehem, unless they were, kept in their little pen and kept alive, but you wouldn't be roving around. So does Christ's birth come around 1225? Most likely not. But what's interesting is, and you can look this up, I'm not going to do a complete lesson on this, but what is fascinating is that Jesus Christ's birth most likely coincides with some of the different feasts that, as you know, that Christ was crucified at Passover, and he was buried during the time of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and rose at what they would celebrate as a part of all this, and then ascended back to earth. Remember, he was here 40 days after his death, burial, and resurrection. And then 10 days later, they celebrated the Feast of Pentecost. And so the church was born on a feast, and Christ was crucified and buried and risen in conjunction with a feast. And so so if you go through the 7 festivals of Israel, you can see that there seems to be some type of correspondence with that, which would be that the next one, trumpets, which is associated with Christ's return, and then the Rosh Hashanah, which is the trumpets, is also the new year, which follows after that the Day of Atonement, which would probably coincide with the tribulation. Then they go right in from that to the Feast of the Tabernacles, which would possibly correspond with the millennium. But how did we get to 1225? Basically this, and this is a thumbnail, because I think this is my topic I would talk about all night, because that's what I did. All of my PhD work is in church history. But when the church was born and Christianity was legalized in 313 AD, there was a real problem. Constantine was a general, an emperor. He had conquered, as you know, his rivals and was in his final battle. And what happened was he was just a Roman general, a pagan as pagans can be. And he was concerned about this battle, so he had this dream. And whether he had it or not, we don't know, but it's just part of history. And at the Milvian Bridge, if you look it up in history, Milvian Bridge, he was there with his legions, and the other enemy forces were there. And in his dream, he saw a cross. And so he had all of his soldiers paint a cross, just a cross, on all their shields. And he, in the dream, his dream was in Latin, by the way, and in hoc signe vince. You probably all have heard that famous saying. In this sign, conquer. In hoc signe vince. You probably say that to each other at home all the time. And this was the sign, the cross. And so Constantine, after winning this battle, in 313 issued an edict as the emperor of the Roman Empire that legalized Christianity. Up until that time, Christianity was not, in fact, in the prior years to this, was the single greatest persecution of the church there'd ever been. Three things happened which affects even our, right down to the Bible you're holding today. The prior emperor had decided that he would do three things. He would kill every known leader of the church, and he hunted them down like they'd never been hunted down before, over 10 years. Then he decided he would destroy every meeting place, and there is not a church standing anywhere in the world that predates him. He destroyed every one of them. By the way, he's the only Roman emperor that retired. He was so good at what he did, his name was Diocletian, that he retired. I mean, he'd done everything. It's kind of like the greatest emperor, and he did everything, and almost extinguished Christianity. This is the closest Christianity ever was to destruction. The last thing he did is he destroyed every copy of the Bible. And there is not one single complete copy of the Bible that predates him. This is the closest Christianity got to extinguishing. And what they did is they broke the manuscripts up, and because every complete, all the books of the Bible, copies, he destroyed. His legionnaires did, and every building and every leader. Well, now, that's for 10 years, so here's Diocletian. Then we go to Constantine. We have a complete, it's kind of like going between administrations in Washington. We have a reversal. Now, all of a sudden, Constantine legalizes. He said another Latin word, religio licita, that Christianity was a recognized religion. He had a problem, though. There were millions of Christians. In fact, Christianity, under this 10-year persecution, Christianity grew more than at any other time, even the first century. In fact, some of the writers of the time wrote interesting things, and one of them said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And the more people they killed, what started happening was that the legionnaires that were leading them out to execute them would take off their gear and get down with them and say, I too am a Christian. And so the emperor, you ever heard, better to join him than to if you can't beat him, join him? Well, he couldn't beat him, so he decided to join him. And he legalized the millions of people that were Christians. But there's another problem in Rome. There was a state religion. Rome had, and you've all heard of this, and some of you probably have even visited it, the Pantheon. And pan means all, and theon means of the gods. And so Rome had this, the reason Rome conquered the world as it did is, it didn't destroy any gods, it just added them. And so the Pantheon was just this big round building that has a little hole in the ceiling, if you've ever been there, where the oculus, where the light comes through. And all the way around the edges of the building, every god of every, they just had niches for them. If you go into the Pantheon, even today, you can see the niches. And every god that Rome conquered their people, they didn't destroy their god. They said, oh, we'll revere him too, or her, or it, or whatever it was. And they just moved them in. And they began to build up a massive priesthood. And so when Constantine legalized Christianity, he had millions of Christians, plus he had thousands of priests that were of the state religion. And Barney's waiting for the connection to Christmas, right? Because most people don't like history. Well, you have millions of Christians, but you have a highly organized priesthood of all these religions. And so Constantine couldn't kill them all because there would be just an empire-wide eruption from that of all these priests, of all these different gods. That's why he didn't say Christianity is the only. He legalized it and allowed Christianity to rise up. What I'm getting to is what we're still dealing with today. This is all of paganism. And paganism, all these gods of the pagans had all their customs. And all of that was merged with the early church, which was legalized. And the early church, all of them were declared a part of the Roman Empire's religion. And so here's a primitive church that is reading the Bible and basically living in the catacombs or wherever they could. I mean, during the prior persecution, those 10 years, they would actually lead people out to the edge, kind of like ISIS. The Roman legionnaires were like the current ISIS people. They would lead the town out to the edge of the cliff, and they'd say, "Are you a Christian?" If they said yes, they'd push them over. And then they look at the next one, "Are you a Christian?" And they'd push them over. "Are you a Christian?" Well, I mean, how far down the line do you have to go before you start wondering what you should say? But they just systematically killed the Christians, especially in the area of Turkey nowadays. And so this early church had suffered so much, and this is the first time they're coming out of their holes and out of their caves, and all of a sudden they're coming out and they are allowed equal footing with all the wealth of the pagan religions. And they're given, you can have buildings and everything, and it all started running together. So now let's think about this. The pagans worshipped they worshiped the myths of the ancient world, which usually involved a mother goddess who was really very important. In fact, every pagan religion has some form of this. A mother goddess who had a son who died and then was resurrected. Did you know that? Did you know that's part of Egyptian mythology? That's part of Canaanite mythology? That's part of Greek mythology? And what's interesting is that the mother goddess, the son, most often in the writings of the pagans, was killed by some horrible thing, mostly like a wild boar or some animal, killed this son of the mother goddess, and then after 40 days, he comes back to life. So this is just one example. So what do you do in the church with all that? Well, the mother goddess becomes, guess who? We talked about her this morning. Yeah. The son of the mother goddess that was killed becomes Christ. The 40 days, any of you former Catholics remember the 40 days of what? Oh, Lent. Do you see what they did when they merged these two? The church began to pick up the paganism. The early church of Christ did not have candles, beads, incense. They did not have vestments, all these different colored outfits that were worn. They did not have the, have you ever seen that? I don't even know the name of it. I'm not a good Catholic, that the Pope wears. That was not in the church. All of the headdresses, or whatever you want to call it, none of that, all of that was just a part of pagan religion, including this calendar. Now, on December 25th, every year was celebrated a global holiday. As you know, let's see, I always forget. I studied astronomy for a while, but one is called the solstice and the other is called the equinox. So whichever it is, the vernal equinox and whatever it is, on December about 22nd is the darkest day on earth. It's the shortest day of the year, where sunlight is least. And then on whatever it is, June something, 21st, I don't know what it is because I'm not a good druid or anything, but anybody that's into this knows that the longest day is something in June, and the shortest day is here. And in the pagans, you know that what they thought is something was eating at the sun, and finally the something, was defeated, and the days started getting longer. And so they called this day the day when the shortest day ended and the longer days started. They called that the Sol Invictus. Now, all these Latin things, sol, sun, and this is when the sun finally overwhelms, not the S-O-N, the sun, the shining sun. And so what they started doing is they would celebrate after this day this victory of the sun. And it was huge. It became kind of like, in Rome at least, it was huge. It was a gigantic celebration because so much of sun worshiping, look at Heliopolis and all the stuff in Egypt, look at Stonehenge. There was such a close proximity of paganism to the sun that this was the biggest, probably, of all the holidays. So, the church, it was interesting. The church went through all kinds of pendular swings about totally against paganism and then, use paganism. And what happened is, by the time of Chrysostom, and Chrysostom was the pastor of one of the larger churches of the world, Constantinople, Constantine, Constantinople. And Chrysostom was quite a pastor. We have his sermons nowadays. They called him the golden orator, the golden tongue. He was a very good preacher, and he preached a sermon saying, why not use the Sol Invictus as a celebration of the real victor, Christ? And they called their celebrations of Christ Mass. So why not make it a Christ Mass? And actually, Chrysostom talked about why not compromising, use Christmas and bring life to it. And so, you can study this. Almost everything from holly to mistletoe to the Yule log, everything that you find out about Christmas has some kind of, pagan something behind it that the church began to use as a connection point with the pagans. And so, when was Christ born? Christ, if you want to know, the Greek Orthodox have figured it out. They said that actually Christ was John the Baptist was 6 months prior. If you read this morning, the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said that 6 months ago, your cousin Elizabeth conceived. And so John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus Christ. And it's very possible, according to the Greek Orthodox, that the conception of Christ was in December. The birth of John the Baptist was in March. And that Christ was born probably sometime around the feast of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, somewhere in there. We don't know. Christ was probably, to get sheep out there, it had to be before September, October, to have sheep grazing out in the hillsides. Probably that would be the latest, because there isn't any grass in the hillsides I mean, I was just there in October, and the sheep were desperate looking for anything to eat. So how did we get, Barney, how did we get December 25th? We got it because of Chrysostom in the biggest church in the world saying, why don't we, since the whole world celebrates this holiday, why don't we take the high ground and go out and introduce Christ at this time? So the bigger question is Christmas celebration pagan? Is a Christmas tree pagan? Why do we have Christmas trees? The pagans had trees. Why do we have trees? Well, Martin Luther went out and cut a tree and dragged it in Wittenberg, Lutherstadt, and celebrated Christmas because it says in Isaiah that the evergreen and the picture of endless life, and Martin Luther even adds this, and he was a former Roman Catholic. So what you didn't ask me is whether I think it's wrong. Did you ask me that, Barney? I don't think the celebration of Christmas is wrong. What I do think is wrong is ever telling children that there's any Santa Claus. Why do you think we should lie to our children in good fun and tell them there's Easter bunnies and Santa Clauses and all this stuff when there is not? When do they start believing us? And when does our stories blur into, when we start telling about Christ, they go, is that one true? You fooled me for my first 6 years with the man I had to be good for, or he wouldn't give me stuff, and it was actually you all the time when they get older and read the mail and see the charge cards, and everything else. But do we really need to go into this? This is only Christmas I talked about. Easter is far worse. Easter is Astarte, Ashtaroth, the goddess of fertility. Why do you think eggs and rabbits are the sign of Easter? That has nothing to do with Christ. Passover. And I'll just share one more thing. Might as well, I always say if you're going to offend them all at once, just hit everything at once. But the Roman Catholic Church gradually became anti-Semitic. This is a lot more than you asked for, but it helps you understand. And so Jesus Christ, we know when he was crucified, buried, and risen. It's on our calendar every year. It's Passover. But the Roman Catholic Church did not want any attachment of the church to the Jews because they were cursed. They were Christ killers. In fact, Martin Luther wrote a pamphlet. Martin Luther, that we're all going to see in heaven, wrote a paper that was published. And it said, "Kill the Christ killers." It was an anti-Semitic writing by one of the reformers, which was read by a later German and used for the Holocaust. He says, hey, Luther, patron saint of the Germans, wrote all this. Why? The Roman Catholic Church did not want the tie to Christ being tied to Passover, so they disassociated Easter with Passover and tried to separate it with a different reckoning so that it would not be concurrent. And when they did that and removed all the Jewishness, what floats in? All the pagan stuff, the bunnies, the eggs, and everything else. So Christian holidays that we celebrate today, the only ones that are in the Bible would be, Jesus actually went to the temple during Hanukkah. Jesus did. It's a celebration of lights. Jesus celebrated the Passover, so did Paul. After he was saved, Paul celebrated the Passover. Now, he wasn't tied to the sacrifices, but he saw them pointing to Christ. So for me, personally, I think that Christmas is a family celebration where we as a church remember Christ, but it's not his actual birth date. Easter is a cultural event where we infuse Christ. But unless we're tying it to Passover, it's rare that Easter ever is concurrent with the true resurrection of Christ. It happens about every, 8 years that by somehow they didn't do it well enough and it lines right up and you see it. But most often, our celebration of Easter is not concurrent with when it really happened. And it's all because of back here what the Roman Catholic Church did. So what does that mean? Should we be like some people are who really don't help the cause? And they are totally protesting Christmas and Easter. But they're Christians. And boy, does that confuse lost people. When you're against Christmas and you're a Christian. Boy, that's interesting. You're against Easter and you're a Christian. Boy, that's interesting. And when you start bringing up all this stuff on the pagan, unsaved people don't understand this. Because it says in 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural man doesn't understand the things of the Spirit of God. So what should we do? We should celebrate Christmas if you aren't, unless you have a conscience against it. And some people do. And some people, I've pastored 35 years, and there are people that are horrified that we have a Christmas tree. In fact, they get ill when they see it in the church. You know what? We should be very cautious not to stick it to them and say, grow up, They have a tender conscience, and some of them are trying desperately to live as pure and biblical a life as possible. And Christmas as we celebrate it isn't in the Bible, and neither is Easter as we celebrate it in the Bible. But what we should do is make the most of this time. They are playing our song right now. They're starting. Even in pagan places, they're playing our songs. Have you ever heard some of the doctrine in the Christmas carols? No more let sin and darkness reign. He comes, and there's all of these incredible doctrinal songs. And, sometime when they're playing one, you just say, wow, did you hear that? No. They don't even hear it. Say, well, listen to what it's saying. And they listen, and you say, do you know what that means? No. I thought it's just a Christmas carol. No, it's most of the ancient Christmas carols have the gospel so prominent. So what I say is, even though it's not 1225, Barney, or even 24 or 26, it's a great time to declare Christ, to in a Christ-like way, it's more blessed to give than to receive, but most of all, to make this a time that we give to Christ. And that really, I remember when I was in seminary at Dallas, that Howard Hendricks, one of the professors there, now with the Lord, used to take their entire budget that they would spend on Christmas, and their family would adopt, kind of like we do, with Angel Tree and the Christmas boxes. And the Hendricks family, their kids would buy the present that they wanted, and they would give that to the poorest of the poor in Dallas, where they lived. And I'll tell you what, that's something your kids would never forget. Not buy one for both. The Hendricks kids gave their present to the poorest person they could find in Dallas, Texas. And they all grew up, if you know anything about the Hendricks clan, they're not very materialistic. Because the parents said, this is not a season for you to tear open and say, I want something else, and tear open another one, and they're all no good by the end of the day. It's a season to sacrifice and to give. So